And in this journey, many slaves also from Africa perished as a result of scarcity of water and little food. Some slaves in Africa, they prefer to take their own life than to go to the New World, especially our African women. Most of them, they throw themselves in the water and then they died. Now, the white people or the slave dealers, they normally have intercourse with our African women so that at least when they give birth, that can increase the slave population. Our topic of dialogue is going to be slave trade. As Africa had experienced 3 forms of slave trade, so I'll be discussing the traditional slave trade. The traditional slave trade is one of the oldest forms of slave trade that ever existed in Africa. Almost every society in Africa practiced this type of slave trade in one way or the other. Both these 2 religions called Islam and Christianity, they also embrace this slave trade called the traditional slave trade. The traditional slave trade, people who cannot pay their debt, people who were captured during wars, and people who practice certain evil acts were captured and sold to this type of slave trade called the traditional slave trade. This type of traditional slave trade existed during the pre-colonial Gambian period before the coming of the Europeans. Our people, our kings and chiefs, were practicing this form of slave trade called the traditional slave trade. Sometimes they will go and raid or attack a particular village, destroy and capture people and sold them to another village. This type of slave trade is called the traditional slave trade. And this type of slave trade too, it is human compared to that of the transatlantic slave trade and the traditional slave trade. It is the civilized form of slave trade in which every institutions in Africa or in the Gambia accepted or practiced it in one form or the other. So this is the traditional slave trade. Trans-Saharan slave trade. The Trans-Saharan trade was a trade that transpired between the people of North Africa and the people of West Africa across the Sahara deserts. During those times, the North Africans will cross the Sahara desert with the use of camels and bring their goods to West Africa. And when they arrive in West Africa, they normally stayed in the trading centers such as Timbuktu and Djenné. Now, the slaves who were captured by our kings and chiefs in the traditional slave trade were sold into these Arabs or were sold to these Arabs. So these Arabs also will chain these slaves both in their necks and also in their hands. They parade them in the form of a caravan to the Sahara desert. And in the Sahara desert, there was a salt mine. So these slaves were required to work in the Sahara desert with little water and little food, which resulted to the death of many slaves during this slave trade. Some historians even write they have seen how many slaves were laid down in the deserts because of they were given little water and little food. Some of the slaves also were taken to the North Africa and also to the Middle East. They were used as servants to these Arabs. Some were beaten to death, the stubborn ones. So this is the Trans-Saharan slave trade. It transpired between the North Africans and the West Africans across the Sahara Desert. It also happened around the 16th century. So the Arabs or the Berbers will cross the Sahara Desert with the use of their camels because the camel can stay for a long period of time without having to take water. So when they arrive in West Africa, they will settle or stay in the trading centers such as Timbuktu and Djenné. Now, during the traditional slave trade, people who were captured by our kings and chiefs were sold to these Arabs. So these Arabs will chain them both in their ankles and in their waist. They march or they paraded them with a caravan to the Sahara Desert. Now, during those times, the Arabs, they established salt mine in the Sahara Desert because salt was an important item during the Trans-Saharan trade. And also the most important item during this Trans-Saharan slave trade were the slaves. They were required to work with little water and little food, which contributed to the death of many West African slaves. Some of the fortunate ones were transported all the way to North Africa and also in the Middle East. They were used as servants to the North Africans. Now the Transatlantic slave trade. The greatest force of human migration is as a result of this trade called the Transatlantic slave trade. This Transatlantic slave trade started in the 16th century, but it reaches at its peak at the 18th century. It came into an existence as a result of the discovery of the New World by Christopher Columbus in 1492. When the New World was discovered, many Europeans, they left their homes, Europe, and they all go to the New World. The first 2 countries that arrived in the New World were the Portuguese and the Spanish. In the later years, the Dutch, the French, and also the British also followed suit. Now, in the New World, they established rich mines and plantations. And in these plantations, they were growing crops such as sugarcane, tobacco, ginger, just to name a few. Now, due to the harsh climatic conditions in the plantations, they realized that they cannot able to do much of the work in the plantations. They decided to capture the native Indians and enslave them against their own will for them to work in the plantations. Now, because of the native Indians also were not strong to do the work, they perished in a large number. That was the time when some religious leaders or Spanish religious leaders such as Bishop Las Casas, they preach about the ill treatments of the native Indians and perhaps persuade them to go elsewhere to find capable men and women who can do the work far better than these native Indians. Now, by that time, the first European nation that arrived in Africa were called the Portuguese. And the first Portuguese explorer to arrive in the mouth of the river Gambia was called Alvisto Caramusto. He arrived in 1455. And some of the Portuguese explorers, they also arrived in Africa. Some of them, when they are returning back to Portugal, they took also along certain Africans to Portugal. Now, these Africans were seen to be hardworking. They were very strong. And perhaps, if they are taken to the New World, they can able to do the work better than the Indians. This was how the Europeans started coming into Africa. When they came at the initial stage, they were obtaining slaves for our kings and chiefs. They give items such as guns, gunpowders to our kings and chiefs. And in return, these kings and chiefs will capture slaves and sell them to these Europeans. But when there was high demand of slaves in the New World, known as America, and also the supply of slaves in Africa was very slow, now they decided to come in force. They will attack a particular village into the interior of Africa, attack a particular village, destroy their properties, capture the able men and women, chain them both in their necks and also in their waists, and also take them into the coast or the coastal areas of Africa. And in these coastal areas, that's where they will stay for a long period of time to wait for the ship. And when the ship arrives, then they will park them inside the ship. And also the journey from Africa to America is referred to as the Middle Passage. And in this journey, many slaves also from Africa perished as a result of scarcity of water and little food. Some slaves in Africa, they prefer to take their own life than to go to the New World, especially our African women. Most of them, they throw themselves in the water and then they died. Now, the white people or the slave dealers, they normally have intercourse with our African women so that at least when they give birth, that can increase the slave populations. But our African women, they prefer to take their own life than to have intercourse with these European white people. This is the transatlantic slave trade. The effects of the slave trade. The effects means the impact or the outcome. The things that had happened after the slave trade. One, it leads to the loss of most of our productive men. Many people lose their life during the slave trade. And two, it leads to the decline of our indigenous industries. Indigenous industries, for example, salt, the iron, and also the carving industries. Because the people who were engaged in these industries were captured and taken. And three, it leads to the decline of trade and agriculture. Our people who were engaged in the cultivation of crops and the rearing of animals, those people also were captured and taken. Yes. And also four, it leads to famine. That is the shortage of goods, shortage of food. The people who were engaged in the production of foods were also captured and taken. So obviously it leads to the reductions or it leads to famine. Yes. And also five, it also leads to the decline of our populations. Because what happened, thousands of slaves were captured in the Gambia and also taken. So of course our population declined or reduced drastically. So these are some of the effects or the impact or the outcome of the slave trade. So now, the reasons for the abolitions of the transatlantic slave trade. The reasons that motivated the slave trade to be abolished. One, less demand for slave. There was less demand for slave due to the industrial revolutions in Europe. Now in 1807, when the slave trade was abolished, the Europeans now, they started to invent machines, and this machine can work far more than human beings. And they no longer need humans to work for them. They decided to abolish or to totally stop the slave trade. And two, humanitarian reasons. Some humanitarians, they also take part in the abolition of the slave trade. People such as Granville Sharp, William Wilberforce, Thomas Clarkson, they campaigned severely to see the slave trade being abolished. Now, the religious reasons. Some of the religious leaders during those days, they also stood up on their feet and they preached about the ill treatment of the slaves. They consider slave trade to be a sin against God and which must be stopped. And finally, it stopped. Yes. So these are some of the reasons for the abolitions of the slave trade. Now to the ways in which or how the abolition of slave trade were achieved. When the slave trade was abolished in 1807, still we have other Europeans who were coming, penetrating and capturing African people and still shipping them to the New World. But now, in order to totally stop that art or practice, there were certain modalities that were put in place in order to totally monitor the abolitions of the slave trade. So one was merciful decision. Lord Merciful of England was a judge. He ruled that any slave who ran and entered into England, he is considered to be a free slave. And also many slaves in the New World or Europe, they also ran and entered into England, they are considered to be a free slave. Now, the other reason also on how the abolition of slavery were achieved is the British Naval Squadron. When the British wanted to totally stop the transatlantic slave trade, they now decided to station their navies in the coast of Africa. And these navies were responsible for monitoring any ship that is coming or leaving the African Sea. Sometimes, if they realize that this ship is having slaves, so this ship is captured and they return all the slaves back. And the ship is later sold for auctions. Now, the other reason also that leads to the achievements of the abolitions of the transatlantic slave trade is the Equipment Clause Treaty. The European powers who were interested to stop the Atlantic slave trade, they signed an agreement that any slave that is being found having the slave materials such as chains, and also other materials, that ship will be seized and also later sold into auctions. Yes. So now the other reason also how the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade was achieved was the founding of Banjul. Batos was founded by the British in 1816. There was a captain called Sir Alexander Grant. He obtained Batos from the then king of Combo called Tumani Bojang by the annual payment of 103 bars of iron, which is equivalent to 25 British pounds. So he used that to obtain Batos from this king called Tumani Bojang. Because Banjul or Batos was strategically located, because it is found in the mouth of the river Gambia, you can able to see the movement of the ship in the coast. So Batos was also founded in order to totally suppress the transatlantic slave trade. Now also the founding of Fort Blen, or the building of Fort Blen in 1826, when the fort was built in Barra. And this fort was also found in the mouth of the river Gambia. It is well strategically located. This fort was founded in order to totally suppress the transatlantic slave trade. The introduction of legitimate trade also contributed greatly to the abolitions of this transatlantic slave trade, because they realized our kings and chiefs, they were only trading with human beings. Now the Europeans now decided to introduce another form of trade called the legitimate trade. This legitimate trade, the people were engaged in the buying and selling of goods and service without the involvement of human beings. So these are some of the ways in which the abolition of slave trade was achieved in the Gambia. In 1884, the European powers were embroiled in key competitions over River Congo. The Britain supported the Portuguese claim over River Congo, while France and the Belgians also opposed the idea. Now, to support the matter from causing a war, the then Vice-Chancellor of Germany called Otto von Bismarck, he invited these European powers who were interested in acquiring territories in Africa. Now, the powers that attended the conference were Britain, France, Germans. The topic of dialogue is going to be the scramble for and the partitions of Africa. Now, the scramble for and the partition of Africa, this refers to the competitions among European powers to possess territories in Africa and the subsequent divisions of Africa. It started in 1880s, and by 1905, the whole of West Africa had been scrambled and partitioned except Liberia and Ethiopia. But it should be remembered that before 1800, certain territories in Africa were already been occupied, such as Britain, such as Batos, Saint Louis, and also Gore. these territories were occupied before the scramble and partitions of Africa. Now, the causes for the scramble and partitions of Africa. One, desire for market. Due to the industrial revolutions in Europe, the Europeans were in need of industries or markets where they can sell their products. And also in these industrial revolutions, they produce machines that can work faster than human beings. Now they were producing goods in a higher quantity and they need markets where they can sell their products. So they decided to divide Africa among the European powers so that at least they can have a market where they can sell their products. Now, the white man burdens. The white man also believe they have a divine guidance or they are superior to the black man. They can rule the black man. That's why when they came in West Africa, they enslaved the Africans and later they divide Africans among the European powers. Now, the desire or inside of investment outlet. The Europeans, they need investment outlets where they can invest and also generate revenue. There was no place better than Africa. So that's why when they came in Africa, they enslaved the Africans and also in the later years, they decided to scramble and partitions Africa among the European powers. Now, the other causes for the scramble and partitions of Africa is the European unemployment. There was high rate of unemployment in Europe. And also there was lack of space in Europe. So that's why when they came, they decided to colonize Africa. So for example, the Gambia was colonized by the British and also Senegal was colonized by the French. So they have to bring their European people to stay in their colonies. For example, South Africa. South Africa is a country in Africa. So because of there was lack of space in Europe, they decided to come to Africa. And in fact, some of them are still settling in Africa. So these are the causes for the scramble and the partitions of Africa. Now the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. In 1884, the European powers were embroiled in key competitions over River Congo. The Britain supported the Portuguese claim over River Congo, while France and the Belgians also opposed the idea. Now, to support the matter from causing a war, the then Vice-Chancellor of Germany called Otto von Bismarck, he invited these European powers who were interested in acquiring territories in Africa. Now, the powers that attended the conference were Britain, France, Germans, the Belgians, they all converged in this conference. Now, it was in this conference when the map of Africa was brought out and Africa was puzzled or divided among European powers who were interested in acquiring territories in Africa. No African leader was invited to attend the Berlin Conference. It was only attended by the European powers who were only interested to acquire territories in Africa. And now in this Berlin Conference, the European powers, they agree on certain conditions or terms. Now, one of the agreements that was made in the Berlin Conference was effective occupations, which means all European powers that occupy territories in Africa should make sure they effectively occupy the territories in Africa that they already occupied. Now, notifications. This means all European powers who occupy territories in Africa should notify or should inform their other European counterparts so that at least it can ensure peace among the European powers. Now, the other agreement also that was made in the Berlin Conference was the abolition of slave trade, which means all European powers that acquire territories in Africa or that colonize a particular territory in Africa should make sure they totally abolish or condemn slave trade in a particular region. So that's why after the Berlin Conference of 1884, the slave trade now was finally abolished. Now, the other agreement also that was also reached in the Berlin Conference is social and economic reform. It was an agreement that was transpired among the European powers, which means any European powers that colonize a particular territory in Africa should make sure they rehabilitate the economies of that particular country. That's why when the French colonized Senegal, they introduced a system of administration called assimilations. Now, in this system, if you are born in a certain region, in Senegal, for example, Gorée and Saint Louis, then you are considered to be a citizen with equal right with those that are born in France. So they have to rehabilitate the economies and also the social status of that particular country. So these are the agreements or the decisions that were made in the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. Now, the stages in the scrambles and partitions of Africa. Basically, there are 3 stages in the scramble and partitions of Africa. The first stage is the signing of treaties with the African rulers. Because the Europeans, when they wanted to divide Africa among European powers, they signed treaties with our kings and chiefs. Now, when they are done with the signing of treaties, now the treaties will pave the way for them to finally colonize that particular territory. Now, the second stage in the scramble and partitions of Africa is the conclusions of the treaty. When they conclude the signing of the treaties with our African rulers, now they know that they have a colonies or a territory that they can occupy. Now, the third stage is the movement of troops. Because when they colonize a particular territory, they need to bring in their troops so that at least they can ensure peace and stability in that particular colonies that they colonized. So these are the 3 stages in the scramble and the partitions of Africa. These are the 3 stages in the scramble and partitions of Africa. The method used to occupy African territories. And also basically there are 3 methods of occupying African territories. One is treaties and peaceful negotiations. The Europeans, they have to come, or when they came in Africa with the intention of colonizing Africa, they decided to negotiate with our kings and chiefs. And after the negotiation, they will sign a peace treaty to ensure the smooth colonization of that particular territory. Now, the other method used to occupy African territory is the gun boat diplomacy. They have to bring in their big guns and encamp them in the colonies that they colonize to ensure also peace and stability within that particular colonies. Now, the other method also used by the Europeans to occupy African territory was the outright military conquest. When they came, they signed a treaty with our African chiefs. So in an event that our African kings and chiefs refuse to surrender their own land or territories, then the Europeans now will bring in their military soldiers. For example, in the Gambia here we have the Soninke Marabou, and this Soninke Marabou transpired between the Soninkes, who were the non-believers, and the Marabouts, who were the Muslim scholars. Now there was a Marabou called Fode Kabadume. Now, Fode Kabadume was very powerful to an extent that resisting against the Europeans, both the British and the French. Now, when Fode Kabadume was killed in 1901, the British now decided to bring in their big guns and place it inside the country. Now, because of this big gun, it enabled them to finally colonize the Gambia. These are the methods used to occupy African territories. The reasons for the conquest of West Africa. The reason for the conquest of West Africa. 1, the Europeans were using superior weapons, while our African people were using inferior weapons. 2, the European armies were well trained and well fed, while the people of West Africa were not well trained and well fed. And 4, the European armies were well professional. They are well trained, capable, while the African soldiers were not. Now 4, the African kings and chiefs, they failed to sign or to form an alliance against the European powers. That also is a factor that contributed to the conquest of West Africa. Now the advantages and the disadvantages for the scramble for and the partitions of Africa. Advantage. 1, it ended the intertribal wars in Africa. Because when the Europeans came, they colonized Africa. Britain colonized the Gambia. The Portuguese colonized Guinea-Bissau. The French colonized Senegal. Now, when they colonized the African countries, they ensure peace and stability. They threaten our kings and chiefs to ensure peace and stability in the colonies. Now, 2, it also improved our agricultural system. Because they introduced new varieties of crop and they encourage our farmers to engage in commercial agriculture rather than subsistence agriculture. 3, it also improved our health system. They were able to bring in their new medicines called tablets, for example. And also they construct hospitals across the entire length and breadth of the African countries that they colonized. Yes. Now also 3, they also introduced Western educations. Now this Western education, it enabled the Africans to attend. And after attending, they acquire knowledge about this Western education, which contributed to another topic called nationalism. Nationalism came into existence as a result of the Western education that has been introduced. And also 5, it also led to the introduction of a region called Christianity. Because when African continent was divided among European powers, they introduced their religion called Christianity. So these are the advantages for the scramble and the partitions of Africa. Now to the disadvantages for the scramble for and the partitions of Africa. One, it led to the loss of African sovereignty, because Africans, they totally lost their sovereignty. Now two, it also led to the loss of African lands. Many lands have been confiscated by the Europeans. For example, in South Africa, some of the lands are still in the hands of the British. Now, the other disadvantage for the scramble for and the partitions of Africa, it leads to the introduction of European culture. Because when they came, they introduced Western education, they introduced their religion called Christianity, they also now introduced their culture. So the African people accepted the European culture. So these are the advantages for the scramble for and the partitions of Africa. Many more topics will be discussed here in this YouTube channel. Stay tuned while you subscribe.